2021 was a hell of a year for Apple, but there's one thing I desperately want from them in 2022. Hello and welcome back to Ellis Reviews, and thank you for subscribing if you have, and if you haven't subscribed, you know where the button is. On a recent episode of the 8 or 16 podcast, if you haven't subscribed to that or listened to an episode yet, go and check it out. My co-host Rob decided to list the number of things that Apple has released during 2021, and it was a colossal list. I've got some of it here. So there were 4 new iPhones, 3 new iPads, 3 new Macs, which had very big changes to the design and also the chips running inside them, a new Apple Watch, a whole raft of new accessories including AirTags, and a whole bunch of new services including iCloud Plus and the Apple Music voice plan. And that's before we get to macOS, iOS, and yep, new HomePod mini colours. Oh, and the purple iPhone. But it does make you wonder how they can top it in 2022. But I think they can, and I think it comes down to one new release in particular. For me, the biggest release from Apple in 2022 needs to be iPadOS 16. Here's why. Firstly, there's nothing wrong with iPadOS 15. There's some really cool stuff in there, and it's made some differences to the way that I run this business. But there's one glaring omission, and that's the fact that it still does not take advantage at all of the M1 in the new iPad Pro. Now, I was an early adopter of the iPad. I bought one back in 2010 when it was basically just a big iPhone, and understandably and completely fairly, my friends and family mocked me. Their point was that it just seemed to be an expensive, massive iPhone. That wasn't 100% accurate, obviously, it's not a phone, but I can kind of see where they were coming from. The problem is iPadOS 15 still makes it look a bit like a giant iPhone. Even though we've seen the introduction of things like widgets, it still is just this great big sea of app icons. And the different sized iPads, of which there are many these days, still don't really take full advantage of those different size screens. One of the best examples of this, or worst examples of this, is the iPad mini, the new iPad mini, which has this weird gap on the left and right hand side between the edge of the screen and where the app icons start. But I think iPadOS has much deeper problems than that, and it goes right back to what I was saying at the start of this video with that M1 iPad Pro. It just does nothing with that chip. And the reason this is an issue is because for years, in fact ever since the iPad first hit the market, it has always completely smashed the competition. If you know me, you know that I don't take much of an interest at all in benchmarks, but you can't ignore the fact that everything from the iPad mini to the 12.9-inch iPad Pro and even the 9th generation normal iPad really just obliterate everything else when it comes to benchmarks. But what I want now is an iPad operating system that harnesses all of that power that the iPad has and provides the tools, the hooks, the APIs, everything we need to enable a truly professional experience on those tablets. So I still think that putting the M1 chip in the iPad Pro is an utter waste of time, but there are a few things Apple could do to sort this out. I don't ask for much, really. I want 2 things from iPadOS 16. The first one is better differentiation between the different sized iPads, and the second thing is Pro app support. Firstly, let's get shot of those great big home screens that are just full of apps. And we joked about widgets on the 8 or 16 podcast, but I just don't think that's the answer. I want to see iPadOS 16 make better use of that screen estate. For instance, what is to stop Apple creating a built-for-touch, macOS-like desktop for the iPad? It doesn't have to look or even operate in the same way as the macOS desktop. It can be built completely for touch and make the best use of all of that screen estate. And the same goes for split screen apps and multitasking. Multitasking has never really worked properly on the iPad. It's always felt very kind of shoehorned in and like a last minute decision. And yeah, iPadOS 15 has made some strides to making it a little bit easier, but it's still a bit ham-fisted. Why not just give us proper windowed apps on the iPad? I think Apple's just painting itself into a bit of a corner by shoehorning in these traditional desktop-like functions like multitasking into a touch-based operating system. That tactic rarely works, but if Apple steps backwards, as they have done with the recent new MacBook Pros, that can be progress too. And just to reiterate, I'm not suggesting they make iPadOS exactly like macOS because, one, they've always said that's not going to happen. That convergence of those 2 operating systems isn't on the cards. Fine, no problem with that whatsoever. And when it comes to Pro app support, I'm thinking very selfishly here. So for me, that would be Logic Pro and Final Cut Pro. At the moment, they are only available on macOS. But with the way that iPadOS is currently designed, I can't really imagine something like Logic Pro, for instance, being much fun on an iPad. Even if we look at something as simple as file management, I try and use my iPad as much as I can for work. But as soon as I encounter something where I need to start working with files, whether it be copying files from one location to another, or just working with folders and all that kind of stuff. I always find it a bit impenetrable on iPadOS, and I always, almost without fail, end up going back to the Mac. If the iPad was just a little bit more computer-like, I would stay on the iPad. I wouldn't even think about using the Mac. And I think file management and the ability to run things like Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro would be a reality. The iPad is a completely new paradigm. I completely understand that. We shouldn't think of the iPad as a traditional computer. Again, I completely understand that and agree with it. But if we look at progress elsewhere, for instance, electric vehicles, an electric vehicle doesn't demand that you drive it differently or that the roads are designed in a different way. They take the basics of what makes a car inherently easy to use and just modernize them. That's what we need from iPadOS 16. I want Apple to stop shoehorning in features that simply don't work on touch-based interfaces or which are so hard to discover that only 3% of people actually find them. There's a reason they've faffed around so much with multitasking in iPadOS. It just doesn't quite work at the moment. More importantly, and again a little bit selfishly, I'd like a reason to buy that M1 iPad Pro. The idea of having a device like that I can take to a coffee shop and work on some music or do a little edit on Final Cut Pro, that's a dream, particularly now that I have the great big 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is a bit of a beast to carry around, to be fair. Just to have the ability to move the project I'm working from on that MacBook to an iPad Pro that can do the exact same stuff because of that M1 chip, that is really exciting. But will Apple make my dreams come true next year? Only time will tell. If you've still got some time, keep watching for a link to a video I did recently where I talk about the process of moving from macOS to Windows 11. As you can imagine, being a Mac guy, I discovered quite a lot. But until next time, thank you as always for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.